If you've ever walked past a modern bar on a Friday night and thought, that's loud, crowded, and smells faintly of regret, congratulations, you've already got a good sense of what a medieval tavern was like. Just replace the neon signs with soot-blackened beams, swap the karaoke machine for a drunken minstrel, and change the faint scent of citrus cleaner to the unmistakable aroma of wet wool, wood smoke, and ale-soaked floorboards. The medieval tavern was not just a place to drink. It was a social hub, a news station, a halfway decent kitchen, and occasionally the scene of an impromptu wrestling match over who was holding the better seat near the fire. For the weary traveler, or the local villager looking to escape a day of hauling water, the tavern was the closest thing to a hug you could pour into a cup. But of course, a tavern was also a place to eat, and in the Middle Ages, that meant you were rolling the dice every time you lifted a spoon. Some nights, the food was genuinely good. Other nights, it was the kind of meal that made you wonder if the cook was angry at the world and expressing it through stew. Let's start with pottage, the unchallenged heavyweight champion of medieval tavern menus. Pottage was not a recipe so much as a concept. Take a pot, put in water, add whatever you have, and boil it until the ingredients have given up their individual identities. The result was thick, steaming, and somewhere between soup and porridge. On a good day, pottage might include fresh vegetables, a bit of barley, and maybe even a scrap of meat. On a bad day, you were mostly eating yesterday's pottage, reheated, reboiled, and reimagined as today's special. Taverns loved pottage because it was cheap, filling, and could be kept simmering over the fire for hours, ready for any customer who staggered in from the rain. Diners loved it because, well, they were hungry and it was hot. The trick was to eat it without thinking too hard about what had gone into it, especially if the tavern had a cat. Cats were useful for keeping the mice away, but their relationship with the cooking pot was casual. If you wanted something more solid, there was tavern bread, the eternal companion of every medieval meal. Forget the soft, fluffy loaves you see in modern bakeries. Tavern bread was dense, heavy, and capable of leaving a dent in the table if you dropped it. Freshly baked bread was a treat. More often, you got bread from a few days ago, which could be used as a tool, a weapon, or a building material in emergencies. But the bread wasn't just for eating. In many taverns, slices were used as trenchers, edible plates. The cook would ladle stew or meat onto the bread, and as you ate, the bread would soak up the juices. At the end of the meal, you could eat the trencher itself, now soft and flavorful from all the drippings, unless you were in the habit of thinking about whose hands had been resting on that bread before it reached you. This was considered the height of practicality. For those craving a bit of protein, the tavern might offer roast meat. Now, roast was a generous word. The meat was often cooked over an open fire, turning slowly on a spit that creaked like an old door hinge. If the tavern was doing well, you might get pork or beef. If not, you might be gnawing on rabbit, pigeon, or something the cook cheerfully referred to as forest fowl, which was less a species and more a suggestion. The seasoning: salt if you were lucky, pepper if the tavern keeper had connections, and a mysterious herbal blend if the local hedge witch had been by with her basket of culinary weeds. Sometimes these herbs made the meat taste better. Sometimes they made your mouth go slightly numb, which conveniently distracted you from the fact that the meat had been hanging in the pantry a little too long. And then there was cheese, the universal medieval side dish. Tavern cheese came in two main varieties: young and squeaky, or old and formidable. The young cheese was fresh, mild, and easy to eat. The old cheese had the sort of personality that could clear a table. Some travelers swore by the flavor, others swore at it. Either way, it filled the belly and lasted a long time without spoiling, or at least without spoiling any more than it already had. Of course, no tavern experience was complete without ale. Ale was the lifeblood of the medieval drinking house, cloudy, yeasty, and low in alcohol by modern standards, but safer than water and far more cheerful. It came in wooden mugs or earthenware jugs, and it was often brewed right there on the premises. Brewing ale was as much an art as a gamble. Sometimes it turned out smooth and rich, perfect for washing down a plate of roast meat. Sometimes it had a sharp, sour tang that made you question your choices. But ale wasn't just for drinking. It showed up in cooking too. Stews were thickened with it, bread dough was moistened with it, and in desperate moments, stale bread was soaked in it to make a rustic, boozy mush that some patrons swore by and others swore off. On special occasions, the tavern might break out mulled wine. This was wine heated with spices like cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg, assuming the tavern could get them. Mulled wine was a treat, warming you from the inside and covering up any rough edges in the wine's flavor. The spices were expensive, so the portions were small, but even a sip could make you feel like you'd just been upgraded in life. And then there were the snacks, the little bites you could nibble between tankards of ale. Roasted nuts, pickled vegetables, fried fish cakes, or in coastal towns, crispy fish skin cracklings. The latter were exactly what they sound like. Bits of fish skin fried until they were crunchy, then sprinkled with salt. They were surprisingly addictive, and they had the added bonus of making your breath smell like you'd been personally blessed by Poseidon. But perhaps the most beloved snack of all was the meat pie, the tavern cousin of the grand medieval pasty. A good meat pie was a golden brown treasure, with a flaky crust and a filling of diced meat, onions, and herbs. A bad meat pie was still edible, provided you didn't ask too many questions about the meat. Taverns were also the great equalizers of medieval society. Inside, you could find a knight in travel-stained armor sitting next to a farmer in mud-caked boots, both tucking into the same pottage. Gossip flowed as freely as the ale, news of the latest royal scandal, rumors about bandits on the road, or wildly exaggerated fishing stories that grew more impressive with each retelling. And yet, despite the smells, the noise, and the occasional mysterious lump in your stew, there was something deeply comforting about a medieval tavern. The fire crackled in the hearth, the ale warmed your stomach, and the chatter around you made the world feel smaller and friendlier. You didn't come here for fine dining, you came for the feeling of belonging, for the chance to forget your worries for an evening, and for the faint hope that tonight's pottage might actually be better than yesterday's. The tavern was where deals were made, songs were sung, and sometimes fights were started over nothing more than the last slice of cheese. It was a place of imperfect food and perfect stories, where each meal was part of a larger tapestry of life in the middle. Ages, and if you happened to leave smelling like smoke, ale, and roasted meat, that was just part of the charm. If the first round of tavern food had left you satisfied, the second round was where things got interesting. And by interesting, I mean potentially regrettable. The later it got, the looser the rules became. Recipes that began as respectable, dishes gradually transformed into whatever could be thrown together from the kitchen stores without starting a fire. One of the evening favorites was black pudding, a dish that lived somewhere between sausage and dare, made from pig's blood, thickened with oatmeal and seasoned with whatever spices were handy. It was boiled, cooled, sliced, and fried until crisp on the outside. If you didn't think about it too much, it was delicious, savory, rich, and satisfying after a few tankards of ale. The trick was to eat it quickly before someone explained exactly what it was made of, at which point you had to decide whether to keep chewing or set it down politely and hope the cook wasn't watching. For those with a sweeter tooth, taverns sometimes offered fruit pastes, thick, sticky blocks made from boiled down apples, pears, or plums mixed with honey. They were the medieval ancestor of the fruit jelly cube, except these had the tendency to glue themselves to your molars for the rest of the night. Still, they were a pleasant change from salt-heavy meals and could be paired with cheese for a surprisingly elegant bite, assuming you ignored the fact that you were eating it on a wooden bench next to a man loudly arguing with his own reflection in a mug. By this time in the evening, the ale had been flowing for hours, and it was starting to show. The minstrel had moved from polite ballads to songs that made the friar in the corner pretend he couldn't hear the lyrics. A game of dice had erupted near the hearth, attracting a crowd of onlookers who were either cheering for the players or jeering at them. It was hard to tell the difference over the noise. In the kitchen, the fire roared on, and the smell of roasting meat mingled with the sharper scent of vinegar from the pickle jars. Pickles were the unsung heroes of the tavern menu, a cheap, easy way to preserve vegetables and add a sharp bite to balance the richness of fried or roasted food. You could get pickled onions, pickled cucumbers, pickled turnips, and, if you were unlucky, pickled things the tavern keeper had forgotten to label. These mystery pickles were an adventure in every bite, ranging from tangy and refreshing to why is this burning my nose from the inside. Then there were the tavern eggs. In the cities, eggs were often hard-boiled, shelled, and then preserved in brine or vinegar until they took on a flavor that could politely be described as bold. They were cheap, they lasted a long time, and they went surprisingly well with ale, though whether that was due to taste or simply the numbing effects of alcohol was up for debate. In rural taverns, eggs might be fried in bacon fat and served with a slab of bread, the yolks spilling out onto the trencher in a golden pool that demanded immediate dipping. The tavern also had a knack for turning leftovers into new dishes. A bit of yesterday's roast could be chopped up and mixed with herbs to make a hand pie. Cold pottage could be fried into thick cakes for breakfast the next morning. Stale bread might be crumbled into broth to bulk it out. Waste was frowned upon, and in a place where the menu was half survival and half invention, the ability to disguise yesterday's dinner as today's special was a respected skill. And then came the game meats, a sure sign that someone in the tavern had a friend. In the local hunting party, venison, wild boar, partridge, even hare might make an appearance, roasted or stewed with vegetables. The richer taverns prided themselves on their game dishes, while the poorer ones made do with whatever was caught, trapped, or bartered for. Some of these meats were a treat. Others had a flavor that suggested the animal had been in a bad mood for most of its life. If you were lucky enough to be in a coastal tavern, the menu expanded to include seafood pies, layers of fish, shellfish, and herbs baked under a crust. These were aromatic, filling, and sometimes contained surprises in the form of a stray fishbone that could turn one bite into a medieval dental emergency. By now, the atmosphere in the tavern was a living, breathing thing. The air was thick with smoke, the tables were sticky with spilled drink, and the floor had developed its own unique tackiness underfoot. But nobody cared. The laughter was louder than the creaking beams, and the smell of food drifting from the kitchen kept everyone anchored in the here and now. And just when you thought you'd seen everything, the tavern keeper might send out a plate of fried dough twists. These were strips of dough, twisted and fried until golden, then sprinkled with sugar if the tavern could afford it, or drizzled with honey if not. They were hot, messy, and the kind of snack that made you forget about the wind howling outside, and the mud waiting on the road home. Some customers stayed until the last candle guttered out, sipping slowly on small beer, a weaker, everyday brew that could be drunk for hours without toppling over completely. Others left early, clutching a wrapped hunk of bread and cheese to take home. And then there were the few who, for reasons known only to themselves, ordered the tavern special, a concoction that varied by establishment, but generally involved mixing leftover bits of food into a thick stew and serving it to anyone brave enough to try. Leaving the tavern was like stepping back into the real world. The air outside was cold and damp, the streets dark except for the occasional lantern, and the sound of the tavern's laughter fading behind you made the night seem quieter than it really was. But you carried a little of that warmth with you, in your belly, in your bones, and in the faint scent of smoke clinging to your clothes. The tavern had fed you, entertained you, and, in its own way, looked after you. It had given you a place to be part of something larger than yourself, a shared table, a shared fire, and a shared understanding that life was better with a hot meal, a full mug, and good company, even if you couldn't quite identify the meat in your pie. And tomorrow, when the day's work was done and your boots were muddy again, you'd probably find your way back to the same bench, order the same pottage, and pretend you didn't notice the same mysterious lump floating in it, because that was the magic of the medieval tavern. No matter what it served, it always gave you exactly what you needed. There were ordinary tavern nights, and then there were festival nights, evenings, when the place swelled with more bodies, noise, and questionable decisions than the walls were probably designed to handle. On festival night, the tavern doors stayed open late, the candles burned lower, and the menu expanded in both ambition and recklessness by the time you arrived. The air was already heavy with the smell of roasting meat and the sharp tang of spiced wine. The long tables groaned under the weight of food platters that were being picked clean almost as quickly as they were set down. Minstrels had given up on gentle background music and were now locked in a friendly but increasingly competitive battle to see who could get the most people clapping along. The festival roast was the centerpiece. In most taverns, that meant a whole pig, its skin crisped to a golden lacquer, turning slowly on a spit. In richer towns, it might be a deer or even a small cow, the kind of feast that made strangers into friends and friends into rivals over who got the best cuts. The meat was carved thick and served with gravy rich enough to make you forget it probably started out as yesterday's stew, boiled down and given a new life. Alongside the roast came herb-stuffed fowl chickens, geese, or ducks packed with breadcrumbs, sage, onions, and whatever spice the tavern keeper had been hoarding for months. The stuffing soaked up the juices until it became as prized as the meat itself. Some diners swore the stuffing was better than the bird. Others were too busy reaching for seconds to argue. Then came the festival pies. Unlike the humbler meat pies of a normal night, these were oversized, their golden crusts decorated with pastry leaves or braids, a sign that the cook had actually had the time and the flour to show off. Inside, the fillings were richer. Tender lamb with prunes, beef with ale gravy, chicken with leeks and cream. A good pie didn't last long on the table. A bad one didn't either, but for entirely different reasons involving too much pepper and not enough meat. There was also festival bread, lighter than the tavern's usual loaves, sometimes even sprinkled with seeds or brushed with egg to give it a glossy top. This was bread that begged for butter, the kind that made you forget you had sworn to pace yourself. By your third slice, you'd be pretending you were still just tasting it. And because festival nights called for indulgence, the tavern kitchen turned out sweet treats that you might not see again for months. Honey cakes, their tops sticky and glistening in the firelight. Fried dough balls rolled in cinnamon sugar if the spice chest was feeling generous. Almond pastries, so rich you had to wonder which noble's pantry had been, mysteriously lightened to make them possible. Drink flowed faster than ever. Ale was poured in great jugs. Wine was ladled steaming from pots, and in the corner a small barrel of mead was opened, sending a sweet floral scent into the air. Mead was expensive, but on festival nights, even the more cautious tavern keepers loosened their grip. It tasted of honey and warmth, the sort of drink that made your cheeks glow and your decision-making skills quietly slip out the back door. The tavern was packed shoulder to shoulder, a crush of bodies leaning in over tables, raising mugs and shouting to be heard over the music. Old men argued over card games, young couples laughed in the shadow of the hearth, and travelers traded tall tales for refills. The floor was a tangle of boots and dropped crumbs, and somewhere under one table, a small dog was doing very well. For itself, between courses, the tavern staff worked like a small army, weaving through the crowd with trays of food, ducking, swinging elbows, and somehow never spilling more than a few drops. The cook barked orders from the kitchen door, a wooden spoon in hand like a general's baton. Plates came and went in a blur. Roasted root vegetables, slick with fat, bowls of lentil stew thick enough to stand a spoon in, platters of salted fish whose aroma could cut through the smell of roasting meat. As the night went on, the snack platters made their rounds, bowls of roasted chestnuts, still warm from the fire, skewers of grilled mushrooms brushed with butter, and crisp flatbreads topped with herbs and cheese. None of it was fancy, but on festival night, even the simplest food seemed to glow in the firelight. And then there was the tavern pudding, a dense, dark creation made from breadcrumbs, dried fruit, spices, and enough ale to make it feel like part of the drinks menu. Sliced thick and served with a drizzle of honey or cream if you were lucky, it was the kind of dessert that stuck with you, in every sense of the word. By now the tavern was a riot of sound. Someone had started a dance near the hearth, the benches pushed back to make room. Boots stamped on the floor in time with the music, hands clapped, and the fiddler played as if the devil himself had challenged him to a contest. Every so often, the smell of the roasting pig would roll across the room, and the dancers would break off to line up for another plate as midnight approached. The food slowed, but the music didn't. The last of the ale was poured, the mead barrel stood empty, and a few customers had settled into that warm, heavy quiet that only comes after too much to eat and just enough to drink. Outside, the festival torches flickered in the streets, but inside, the tavern still felt like the heart of the celebration, bright, loud, and full of life. When you finally stepped out into the cool night air, your stomach full and your ears ringing, the scent of smoke and roasting meat followed you. The tavern would still be there tomorrow, its benches back in place, its pottage simmering as always. But festival night had been something different, louder, richer, messier, a night to remember, even if you woke up the next morning trying to recall exactly how many slices of pie you'd had. Some nights, the tavern felt like the center of its own small world. Other nights, it became the meeting point of a much larger one. When traveling merchants rolled into town, the ordinary tavern menu got a jolt of the unexpected new spices, unfamiliar meats, and recipes that made the regulars lean forward, sniff the air, and mutter, "What in the saints' names is that?" The evening began as it always did, a pottage bubbling in the back, bread stacked on the counter, mugs clinking together, but it quickly took a turn when a group of merchants arrived from the south. They came in carrying small wooden chests and sacks slung over their shoulders, trailing a cloud of scents that didn't belong to the damp northern air. Warm cinnamon, sharp cloves, and something smoky and sweet that made people turn their heads as if expecting a baker to appear. They brought spiced wine, richer and sweeter than anything the tavern usually served. It was poured from heavy ceramic, jugs into mugs, the surface shimmering with oil from the crushed spices floating in it. One sip was enough to make you forget the chill in your bones. The second sip made you start wondering whether you could still feel your knees. From another chest came candied citrus peel, glowing amber in the firelight. It was made by boiling orange rinds in honey until they were soft and sweet, the bitterness tamed but not gone. Most locals had never seen an orange, let alone eaten one, and the tart sweet bite caused more than one raised eyebrow. Some chewed thoughtfully, others spat discreetly into a napkin and went back to their ale. The merchants also brought salted fish from the coast, not the pale, flaky kind the tavern sometimes got, but deep red fillets, dense and rich with the flavor of the sea. They were sliced thin, served with onions and a drizzle of vinegar. At first, only the bravest tried them, but soon the platter was empty, save for a few bones and the sharp scent of salt still hanging in the air. Then there was the foreign stew, a bubbling pot of lamb, chickpeas, onions, and spices so fragrant the tavern's own cook stood in the doorway watching like a hawk. The meat fell apart at the touch of a spoon. The broth was thick and golden, and the flavor was unlike anything most had tasted before. Some said it was the cinnamon, others swore it was the cumin, and one man confidently declared it was magic. Nobody corrected him. On a small side table, the merchants laid out flatbreads, thin, blistered from the fire, and brushed with olive oil. You could wrap them around slices of roasted meat, scoop up stew, or simply tear them apart with your hands. They vanished faster than the tavern staff could refill the platter, and a few locals were already whispering about how to get the recipe. Not all the offerings were immediate hits. One bowl contained pickled lemons, their sharp, almost floral temps, making the unprepared pucker like they'd bitten into a raw onion. Another dish featured dried dates stuffed with almonds, which the tavern keeper liked, but several patrons accused of being too sweet to be real food. The smells of the merchants' dishes began to mingle with the tavern's usual scents: roasting meat, spilled ale, wood smoke, until the air was a tapestry of aromas. The music picked up as the merchants joined in with strange instruments, a small drum, a stringed lute-like thing, and bells that jingled on the beat. Soon, the entire room was clapping along, mugs raised, mouths full. As the night wore on, the tavern's regulars began mixing the new with the familiar. Someone dunked a slice of foreign spiced lamb into their mug of local ale. Another wrapped a slab of venison in the merchant's flatbread and declared it the future of feasting. Even the tavern cook eventually disappeared into the kitchen with a jar of cinnamon, muttering about improvements. By the end of the night, the tables were littered with crumbs, sticky with honey drips, and marked by the dark stains of spilled spiced wine. The merchants packed up what little they had left, promising to return on their next journey. The regulars slumped back in their seats, full in a way that wasn't just about food. Outside, the night was cold and damp as always, but inside, the tavern had been somewhere else entirely, a warm, noisy corner of the world where strange and familiar shared a table. And every bite was an invitation to try just one more thing. The storm began its slow approach hours before the first flake of snow hit the ground. At first it was just the wind, a long, low howl rolling over the rooftops, the sort of sound that makes you instinctively check that the shutters are latched and the fires well fed. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of old pewter, the clouds pressing down as if the whole world were being tucked under a heavy, icy blanket inside the tavern. Though things were already shifting into storm mode, the regulars knew. The signs, the cook ordering the big cauldrons hauled out, the tavern keeper quietly checking the stock of ale. The woodpile moved close to the hearth. A place like this didn't close for weather. If anything, a storm made it busier. The first wave of guests were locals who didn't trust the roads. They came in, wrapped in cloaks thick with sheep's wool, shaking off the first flakes and staking out seats near the fire. The second wave were travelers caught halfway between here and somewhere else. They burst in with wind at their backs, stamping snow off boots, cheeks red from the cold, eyes wide with that mix of relief and disbelief that comes from finding warmth when you thought you'd have to freeze. The tavern smelled like winter. Survival itself, with smoke curling from the hearth, damp walls steaming as cloaks dried, a deep savory undertone from the stew pot already on the boil. Somewhere under it all was the faint, sharp scent of snow melting on hot stone, a smell that once you notice it, you can't unsmell tonight. The menu wasn't just food, it was armor against the weather. In the great iron cauldron, beef and barley stew was thickening into something between a meal and a miracle. Chunks of beef had been simmering so long they surrendered to the spoon with barely a prod, the barley swelling in the broth until each grain was plump and soft. Carrots, onions, and leeks floated lazily on the surface, their colors muted but their sweetness magnified by the slow heat. When a ladleful was poured into a bowl, the steam came up like a fog bank, rich with thyme and black pepper. On the smaller hearth, another pot held cabbage and bacon soup, a humbler dish, but no less comforting. The cabbage had been cooked down until tender, the leaves turning translucent in the smoky broth. Strips of bacon bobbed to the surface, each one carrying a tiny halo of fat that shimmered in the firelight. The smell was enough to make you forgive. Winter entirely, at least until you had to go outside again. For those wanting something richer, the oven was turning out rabbit pies, one after another. Each was a fist-sized dome of golden crust, crimped at the edges like a child's toy. But when you broke it open, the steam carried the scent of rabbit slow-cooked in cream, with carrots, leeks, and a whisper of nutmeg. The crust flaked into buttery shards under your fingers, leaving them greasy in the best possible way. But the drink was where the real sorcery happened. The mulled ale was kept in a large copper pot by the hearth, the liquid turning lazy circles as the heat coaxed the spices to bloom. Cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon sticks floated in the dark surface, along with a few slices of dried apple that had gone soft and golden. One mug, and you could feel your shoulders unclench. 2. And the storm outside seemed like someone else's. Problem, for the truly brave or deeply foolish, there was hot mead, thick, honey-sweet, served in clay mugs that warmed your palms instantly. It didn't take much before you found yourself leaning back in your chair, cheeks flushed, happily agreeing with whatever your table-mate was saying. Even if they were rambling about how snow was actually frozen sheep's breath. At one table, a cluster of townsfolk cracked open roasted chestnuts, tossing the empty shells into a pile on the floor. The chestnuts were sweet and earthy, the kind of snack you could eat without realizing how many you'd had until the plate was empty. At another table, someone had ordered honeyed oatcakes, small, chewy rounds that stuck to your teeth and left your fingers tacky. They were simple, but in the middle of a snowstorm, simple tasted like gold. The music that night didn't try to compete with the weather. It was a slow, steady rhythm, lute strings plucked in patterns that felt as familiar as the heartbeat you only notice when you're very still. A small drum kept time, soft enough that the sound blended with the occasional hiss from the hearth. It was music for talking, and talk people did. Some conversations were cheerful, plans for spring planting, memories of festivals long past. Others were quieter, told in the low voices of those who'd lost something in winters before. There were stories of storms worse than this one, when snow buried the doors and people tunneled their way out in the morning. There were ghost tales too, because winter nights practically begged for them, white-cloaked spirits who wandered the roads, the sound of their footsteps hidden under the wind's howl. Every so often, the tavern door would swing open, letting in a dagger of cold air and a whirl of snowflakes. Heads would turn, the nearest voice would call out, "Close the door." And then, just as quickly, someone would shove a hot drink into the newcomer's hands. By the fourth or fifth time, it became a kind of ritual. Shout, slam, drink, SIGH, and the regulars took bets on who would arrive next. The fire itself became a living thing that night. It popped and hissed as wet logs surrendered there, moisture sending little bursts of sparks up the chimney. Boots steamed where they'd been left too close, and someone's gloves smoked faintly until the owner yelped and pulled them away. The warmth was relentless, the kind that seeped into you slowly until you couldn't tell where your own body heat ended and the fires began by midnight. The snow had buried the bottom half of the shutters, and the wind was still rising. Nobody was going anywhere. The tavern keeper, reading the room as easily as he read a ledger, set out extra blankets, rough wool, smelling faintly of lavender from the summer stores. People began settling in for the night where they sat, or claiming the prime spots. On the floor, near the hearth, the last mugs of mulled ale were drained, the beef stew scraped from the bottom of the pot, the rabbit pies reduced to crumbs. The music slowed to a few final notes, then faded entirely, replaced by the soft rise and fall of sleeping breaths and the constant muffled roar of the storm beyond the walls. Somewhere out there, the wind still howled, but in here, the tavern had become a self-contained world, a circle of light and warmth holding back the cold, and for everyone inside, wrapped in heat, full of food, and lulled by the steady crackle of the fire. There was no storm, no danger, no thought beyond the comfort of this one long winter night. The first sound to break the silence wasn't the wind. It was the smell of bacon. It drifted out from the kitchen before the light had even crept through the shutters, curling its way through the sleeping tavern like a wake-up spell. People stirred under their blankets, blinking at the faint grey light filtering in from the snow-covered windows. Somewhere in the back, The tavern's cook was already at work, and the sizzle of meat on the griddle was the closest thing to music anyone wanted at that hour. The storm had spent itself some time before dawn. Now the tavern was wrapped in a thick, muffling blanket of snow, the kind that made the world feel distant, as if someone had padded the walls of reality. The air inside was still warm from the night's fire, and the hearth glowed a steady orange, fed through the dark hours by whoever woke first and took pity on the rest. The regulars were the first to rise. They stretched like cats, rubbing sleep from their eyes, shaking crumbs and the occasional pine needle from their blankets. Travelers woke more cautiously, blinking at the unfamiliar room before remembering where they were. No one was in a hurry. After all, it would take the better part of the morning for the road to be cleared enough for travel. So, instead of rushing, they drifted toward the smell. The kitchen had shifted into post-storm mode, which was a very particular thing. Breakfast after a storm wasn't just food, it was a victory feast. Every dish was a small celebration that the tavern was still standing, that the roof hadn't blown away, that the snow outside was white instead of grey with ash from a chimney. The first platters carried out were heaped with smoked bacon and sausages, the fat spitting on the iron pans before being piled high and steaming. Beside them, there were oat porridge bowls the size of a man's head, sweetened with honey and sprinkled with dried currants. Next came the loaves of fresh bread, and not the dense travel bread from the night before, but soft warm rounds. Baked that morning, the crusts cracked when you tore them apart, steam escaping in clouds scented with yeast and butter. The cook didn't stop there. She sent out fried eggs with yolks like molten gold, their edges crisp from the pan. She ladled out potato and onion hash, cooked in bacon fat until the cubes of potato were crisp on the outside but still tender within. Someone passed a jug of thick cream to pour over the porridge, and another brought out a crock of apple preserves, so sweet they made your teeth ache. And then there was the spiced cider, hot, sweet, and sharp enough to make your eyes water. On the first sip, for those who preferred their breakfast with more of a kick, the tavern keeper discreetly added a splash of brandy to the mugs. By the time the sun rose high enough to turn the snow outside into a blinding sea of white, the tavern was loud again. People had eaten themselves into contentment, and conversation was flowing. Stories of the storm had already begun to grow in the telling the drifts were up to the windows, which was true for some. The wind strong enough to knock a man off his feet, also true, depending on the man. And the temperature colder than a miser's heart, which was debatable, but entertaining. Children from the village had started to gather outside, their laughter muffled by the snow. A few braver souls ventured out to shovel paths, the tavern keeper among them, tossing the snow aside with practiced swings. The air was so cold that each breath turned into a cloud, hanging in the still air before drifting away. By midday, the sun was bright enough to tempt people outside. The snow squeaked underfoot, and the sky was so clear and blue it felt like someone had scrubbed it clean. Farmers checked their livestock, travelers inspected their wagons, and the children built snow forts along the edge of the road. Someone even rolled a snowman with a crooked carrot nose and a battered felt hat. But it wasn't long before the cold sent everyone scurrying back inside, cheeks red, hands stiff, stomachs eager for round two. The tavern was ready. Lunch was a hearty game stew made from venison brought in by a pair of hunters who'd taken advantage of the clear morning. It simmered in red wine and juniper berries, the meat falling apart into the broth. Beside it, a pot of lentil soup bubbled gently, thickened with root vegetables and flavored with smoked ham. On the sideboards, there were trenchers, thick slices of bread used as edible plates, topped with roast pork and a smear of mustard. For those still cold from their walk, there was peppery turnip mash to warm the belly, along with mugs of dark ale so thick it almost counted as food. The rest of the day blurred into that particular rhythm taverns know well: eat, drink, talk, repeat. The afternoon was for card games, quiet arguments over the rules, and long naps by the fire. Someone brought out a fiddle, and a few reels were played, slow at first, then faster until the cook banged a spoon on a pot to remind them it wasn't yet evening as the sun began to set. The snow outside caught the light and turned everything gold. The tavern windows glowed from within, the same way they had the night before. But now the warmth was not defiance against a storm. It was contentment after surviving one. The shutters stayed open just enough to let the golden light spill onto the snowdrifts outside, a beacon for anyone still on the road. By the time darkness fell again, there was no wind, no threat, only the sound of laughter and the smell of roasting meat. Dinner that night was roast goose with sage and onion stuffing, crisp-skinned and tender, the fat dripping onto slices of parsnip and carrot. Platters of buttered peas and rye bread made their way from table to table, while pitchers of ale refilled as fast as they were emptied. It was the kind of night when no one wanted to leave, even if they could. People lingered over their mugs, reluctant to let the glow fade. And somewhere, in a corner by the fire, a traveller took out a small notebook and began to write, perhaps a record of the storm, perhaps just a list of dishes eaten in 2 days. That would make future readers think this was the tale of a feast, not a blizzard. The snow would last for days. The roads would be slow to clear. But inside the tavern, with bellies full and the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and roast, no one was counting the hours. The thaw didn't arrive all at once. It started with a sound, faint at first, so quiet that it might have been someone pouring water in the kitchen. But then it came again, a soft drip, drip, drip from the eaves. By mid-morning, the icicles hanging from the roof were glistening in the pale sunlight, weeping tiny rivulets down onto the packed snow below. The great white blanket that had wrapped the world for days began to sink and sag, like a quilt losing its stuffing inside the tavern. The regulars noticed before anyone said it aloud. The roads would soon be passable, and that meant visitors. The tavern keeper was the first to move. He had the shutters thrown open wider than they'd been in a week, letting in the pale golden light. The floors were swept, the ashes from the hearth shoveled out and replaced with fresh logs, and the smell of pine resin from the fire mingled with the sharp bite of melting snow. The place felt brighter, expectant, the way a stage feels just before the curtain rises. The first travellers of the thaw arrived just after noon. A pair of merchants from the south, their cartwheels caked in slush, bundled in cloaks dusted with road grit. They came in blinking like owls, still adjusting to the shift from blinding white sunlight to firelit shadows. The tavern keeper had them seated before their cloaks were even off, a jug of ale and a plate of bread and cheese appearing as if conjured. Not long after, a tinker arrived with his pack clinking like a wind chime, smelling faintly of forge smoke. He laid out his wares, knives, hinges, cooking pots, and the kind of odd tools that no one thought they needed until they saw them gleaming in the firelight. A small crowd gathered to finger the goods, the murmur of bargaining weaving into the steady background noise of the tavern. By evening, the place was full again, but this was a different full than the storm nights. Then, It had been survival. Now, it was reunion. People hugged hard enough to make backs crack. Voices raised in greetings that drowned out the scrape of chairs. New faces leaned in close to old ones, exchanging news in fast, eager bursts. Snow wasn't as bad down our way. Lost 3 hens to the cold, but the cows came through. Rivers half frozen, but the ferryman's running again. The kitchen matched the energy. Tonight, there were braised lamb shanks, cooked with rosemary and red wine, the meat pulling from the bone at the touch of a fork. On the side, roasted turnips and carrots glistened with honey glaze, and thick-cut bread came with bowls of herbed butter. A new keg of amber ale had been tapped, its head frothy and pale, and it went down as quickly as the tavern keeper could refill mugs. At one long table, a man with a weathered face and the look of someone who'd seen more than his share of storms began telling a story about a road blocked by wolves. At another, a young woman fresh from the city described the winter markets, her hands sketching the stalls in the air. Even the fiddler seemed to sense the change. The tunes were quicker now, tapping into the pulse of the returning world. A pair of children darted between tables, playing some complicated game that involved ducking under chairs and declaring each other frozen solid until a third child came along to thaw them with a tap. No one minded, not when the air was already thick with laughter as the night deepened. The roads outside froze again, but no one inside cared. The tavern was alive in a way it hadn't been since before the storm. Even the fire seemed to burn with a different color, sharper, more golden, as if it too sensed that this was no longer a refuge from the cold, but the heart of a community, coming back to life. And somewhere in the corner, unnoticed by most, a quiet man in a green cloak sat with a steaming mug and watched the room. His eyes moved from face to face, listening, measuring. A stranger, yes, but one who would not remain. A stranger for long. The stranger in the green cloak didn't speak much during the early hours of the evening. He sat near the hearth, back to the wall, the steam from his mug curling upward and vanishing into the dim rafters. The mug was refilled more often than seemed possible, yet no one quite saw him drink. His boots were caked in a kind of road mud that didn't match the thaw outside, a reddish, clay-heavy smear that hinted at travel from somewhere far south. People noticed him, of course. You couldn't wear a cloak the color of moss in spring without catching the eye in a room full of brown wool and grey linen. But the tavern's rule was simple. A man's business was his own until he chose to share it. So they left him to his corner. It was only when the dinner rush eased and the fiddler had paused to drink that the man moved. He didn't stand so, much as unfold himself, tall enough that the low beams seemed a threat to his head. His boots made no sound crossing the floor, but when he stopped at the bar, conversations nearby faltered. "I'm looking for someone," he said. The words were plain, but the way he said them was not. There was a careful weight to them, like a coin being placed on a scale. The tavern keeper leaned on the bar, wiping his hands. "Aren't we all? You'll have to narrow it down." The man's mouth curved, but not into a smile. He set a small object on the bar, a wooden token, round and polished, carved with a symbol no one at the nearest tables recognized. "She have this," he said, "or she know who does." The tavern keeper studied the token, then slid it back across. "The wood, and what do you plan to do when you find her?" "That," the stranger said, "depends on what she tells me." There was something about the way he said it, not threatening, but final, that settled over the room like a new snowfall. Even the children's game slowed, as if instinct told them not to break whatever this was. the stranger turned away from the bar without waiting for agreement, heading toward the door. A few heads followed him, but he stopped just short of leaving. Instead, he scanned the tables, gaze lingering here, skipping there, until his eyes caught on a figure by the window. A woman with dark hair braided down her back, sipping from a pewter cup. Their eyes met for only a moment, but something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or the sharp curiosity of strangers with unfinished business. And then, as quickly as he'd appeared, the man in the green cloak was gone into the cold night, the door swinging shut behind him. It took a while for the room to warm back up. People pretended to return to their conversations, but the rhythm had shifted. The woman by the window finished her drink slowly, then stood and left without a word. The fiddler began a tune again, but it was softer, like playing to fill space rather than to spark dancing. The tavern keeper kept working, but his eyes drifted now and then toward the door, as if expecting it to open again by the time the hearth burned low. The snow outside was falling again, not the howling storm of weeks past, but the kind that settles gently, hiding footsteps almost as soon as they're made. Somewhere out there, the green cloak was walking the road. And somewhere, perhaps not far, the woman from the window was inside. The fire crackled, the mugs stayed full, and the night moved on. But a new thread had been pulled in the fabric of the tavern's life, and threads have a way of unraveling. The morning after the green cloak's visit began like any other thaw-season day. The fire was stoked before dawn, bread dough was set to rise, and the first mugs of small beer went to the farmers headed out to check on their animals. But beneath it all there was a difference, a kind of sharpened awareness. It started when the miller's boy, hair still damp from the river mist, came in for a heel of bread. He claimed he'd seen a man in a green cloak crossing the stone bridge before sunrise, moving quick despite the snow crusting on the road. An hour later, a pair of drovers swore they'd passed a woman with a braid-like black rope walking toward the forest, her boots leaving no sound in the half-melted slush. By noon, the tavern air was thick with steam from the day's main dish, oxtail stew, slow-simmered until the meat nearly melted, the broth rich with leeks, parsnips, and a ribbon of marrow that gave it a faint golden sheen. The scent filled every corner, mingling with the wood smoke and the faint tang of fresh-cut pine logs stacked near the door. As bowls were ladled out and set in front of customers, the stories began. A carter spoke of seeing the green cloak outside. The old watchtower, head bent close to a cloaked woman, could have been the same one from the night before, he said, but he wouldn't swear it. A shepherd, thawing out his hands by the fire, muttered about hearing voices near the frozen creek, too far from any house to make sense. Even the tinker, still in town from the thaw's first day, leaned across the bar and said in a low voice, "That token he had, I've seen its like before. Not here, not for a long time." The tavern keeper kept serving drinks, kept nodding along, but never offered his own thoughts. He had the look of a man who knows that some stories grow more dangerous when you start believing them. The afternoon rush brought new faces, a young hunter with snow still in his hair, trading rabbit pelts for a plate of roasted pork and winter apples. A weary traveller from the west who downed to mugs of mulled cider before speaking a word. A merchant whose cart smelled faintly of spices, warming his hands over the hearth before unpacking his wares. Every time the door opened, a few heads turned, half expecting the green cloak to step back inside. But he didn't, though the woman from the window didn't return either. By evening, The stew pot was nearly empty, and the common room was loud with talk. But under the laughter, under the clatter of mugs, there was still that hum, a sense that something was happening just beyond the edge of the lamplight, that the warmth of the tavern was holding back a colder wind than the winter outside. And then, just as the fiddler was starting a lively reel, the door opened again. Not the green cloak, not the dark braided woman, a boy, barely 14, face pale with cold, breath puffing in quick clouds. He held something in both hands, wrapped in a strip of wool. The tavern keeper crossed the room in 3 steps. "Where?" he asked. The boy swallowed, eyes darting to the hearth as though the warmth might make what he had to say easier. "By the river bend," he said. "I found this." He pulled back the wool. Inside was a second wooden token, carved with the same strange symbol, only this one was smeared at the edge with something darker than mud. The wooden token sat on the bar like it was daring someone to touch it. No one did. The boy who had brought it in was sitting by the fire now, hands wrapped around a mug of cider, cheeks flushed with both heat and attention. Every so often, he'd glance toward the bar, as though making sure the thing was still there. The tavern keeper stood behind it, not speaking, his face unreadable. Finally, he took a cloth and wrapped the token in it, tucking it beneath the counter as if removing a dangerous blade from sight. "Best not to leave it where folk can stare," he said. The fiddler stopped playing. Even the clink of mugs seemed quieter. That was when the door opened. The man in the green cloak stepped in as if he'd never left. Snow flecked his shoulders, his boots wet with water. He didn't glance around or make any show of greeting. He walked straight to the bar. "You found it," he said. The tavern keeper didn't answer. He reached under the counter, brought out the wrapped bundle, and set it down. The green cloak unwrapped it with careful fingers, turning the token in his hand. His eyes flicked up, scanning the room, and came to rest on the boy by the fire. "You," he said, voice low but carrying. "Where did you see her?" The boy stammered. "By the bend in the river. I thought," but the man didn't wait for the rest. He set the token down, laid a single silver coin beside it, and turned for the door. That was when the woman from the window appeared. She stepped inside without looking at anyone, her braids swinging against her back, boots leaving wet prints. On the floor they stood facing each other in the middle of the tavern, the firelight flickering between them. "You've been looking for me," she said. "I found you," he replied. Neither raised their voice. No one else spoke. It was the kind of silence that seems to stretch and thin until you can hear your own heartbeat. The woman reached into her cloak and drew out a third token, identical to the others. She placed it on the nearest table. "They're yours now," she said, "and the road beyond the river is clear." The man looked at the token for a long moment, then took it. Without another word, the two of them left together, their shapes disappearing into the soft curtain of snow. The door swung shut, and the spell broke. Chairs scraped, mugs were lifted, the fiddler struck up a tune again. But the talk was different, now quieter, with more glances toward the window. The tavern keeper stood for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. Then he shook himself, clapped his hands, and called for fresh logs on the fire. Whatever business had passed through his tavern tonight was over. The stew pot was still half full, the mugs still waiting to be filled, and outside, winter would end soon enough. By the time the last customers drifted upstairs to bed, the snow had stopped. In the morning, the road would shine wet and clear. In the sun, the tokens were gone. The tavern remained. And life, as it always did, went on.